this review by saying that 6-week defamation trial showcased just how toxic, just how degrading, and just how much of a circus Depp and Heard's relationship was. Phew, talk about dysfunctional, eh? It's enough to make any sane, and I strongly stress the word sane, person to not walk but run from any celeb that expresses any type of romantic interest in them. No amount of money is worth living like that. I mean, come on, peeps. Would you ever? Let's get started with Depp's team's closing arguments.
Well, I think Camille did an excellent job in her closing statement. I mean, she covered what needed to be covered. She focused on the many times Heard was caught in a lie. She highlighted the many inconsistencies with Heard's testimonies and her statements regarding the alleged abuse she suffered at the hands of Depp. And she also reminded the jury that Heard was the aggressor in the relationship, and that was a good thing.
Well, for me, I must admit, I was a little bit disappointed that Camille literally read every single part of her closing argument. I guess my expectation was high because Camille was so outstanding in a redirect that I expected her to pace before the jury box, listing blow after damaging blow while looking in each juror's eye as she was poking hole after hole after hole in Heard's legal team's defense. I know, too much time watching law shows, eh? Well, with that being said, Camille did do an outstanding job in recapping every single inconsistency in Heard's testimonies, as well as spotlighting the lack of physical evidence and the lack of witnesses to support Heard's allegations against Depp. It was a very important and strategic refreshing of the jurors' memory of the case right before they go to deliberate. And one of the key points for me was how Camille stated that this was not a trial of Amber against Johnny, but a trial of Amber against Depp. And then she proceeded to read that long list of names of witnesses that were deposed in support of Depp. So remember, part of the validity of a claim is heavily supported by the number of witnesses produced in support of that claim in a court of law. And I was also disappointed at Chu's turn in the closing argument because his part was to discredit Heard's countersuit and show that it shouldn't be entertained. I was thoroughly unimpressed with the tactic he employed of trying to create hero worship in the minds of the juror by basically being a verbal resume of Johnny's work as an actor. I mean, how well loved Depp was in his famous roles was a weak defense, in my opinion. Why? Because we all know that some likable actors have behaved badly and have been exposed in the past. You know, does Bill Cosby, America's favorite TV dad, ring a bell? Hello? So no, I didn't like his argument at all. While Camille never received one single objection from Heard's team during her closing arguments, Chu received 2. Now, granted, they were both overruled, but my point is that Camille was very skilled in wording her closing arguments to garner few, and in this incident, no objections from the defense team.
Yeah. And moving on to Heard's team, Rottenborn's closing was well put together, at least in the sense that he was able to use verbiage that could easily sway the jurors in his direction of reasoning on the case. And that can be done only if the jurors are not paying full attention during the entire trial, and if they tend to forget, like myself, if they tend to forget details that were mentioned days earlier. For example, he started his closing by saying, if you do everything you can to help your spouse, the person that you love, rid himself of the crushing drug and alcohol abuse that spins him into an abusive, rage-filled monster, you're a nag. Now, he said that because he was trying to point finger at Depp's team for making negative remarks about her concern. But then later in his closing, he did the same thing. He used Christie's loving concern for her brother, Depp, as a negative. And what's crazy is that everything Heard did was total opposite of loving concern. So Depp's team was right in using that against her, because what she did was she took pictures of lines of lines of cocaine with glasses of liquor for breakfast. She took pictures of Mr. Depp passed out from drinking, and so on and so on, and she used those things against him. None of that has anything to do with loving concern. But when they decide, speaking of Rottenborn, when he decided to use Christie's text to her brother in requesting that her brother stop his abusive habits of alcohol and drugs, he tried to make it seem as if that was something negative. So if the jury remembers that at the beginning, he did the same thing, brought up that, tried to say that Depp's team, was kind of confusing. Depp's team was using it in a negative light, but he tried to make it seem like it was something good, which it wasn't. But then he turned around and did the same thing that he was accusing Depp's team of doing by making Christie's concern for her brother seem in a negative light. It's just all nonsense to me.
Right. I, for my part, think Ben was clever in flipping the narrative, because he knew not to focus on Amber, but on the wording of instructions on the jurors' verdict forms in conjunction with the First Amendment, to try to prove that it was a matter of freedom of speech as opposed to a case of defamation. So with that approach, he was able to utilize what I like to call is what lawyers are famous for, double talk, which is basically convoluted speech designed to create doubt and to confuse. And I'll explain what I mean when we start actually reviewing the verdict form the jurors must use to deliberate the case. Up next was Elaine's part, who was to give validity to Heard's countersuit. I was initially impressed that she wasn't stumbling. Now, hold up, wait a minute. I said I was impressed initially. But then she began to present her arguments not as bullet points of facts from the trial, but she was basically standing there storytelling, and not very well, I may add, the entire case. I mean, she was rambling on so much without taking a breath that I was scratching my head. And honestly, I had no idea what the heck she was talking about or what point she was trying to make.
Yeah, honestly, Paprika, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, but I can't really speak on her closing remarks, because the whole time she was up there, I kid you not, all I heard was womp, 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 womp. You know, like Charlie Brown. She sounded all over the place, and it was clearly evident in the facial expressions and demeanor of everyone in camera shot that they felt the same way.
Definitely said that. But in any event, she would not cooperate. She didn't want to. But Detective Sandanaga, their domestic relations or domestic violence person, said they should have done an incident report no matter what, even if they decided there wasn't a crime. Because domestic violence has the cycles, they come back, and it's good to have the record for the next time that it might happen. So she said they should have under the circumstances, even if they didn't. And she also said that when they put verbal dispute only in those calls, it is a code that they use, and you'll see that it's twice on that call report. So they to say that's why we didn't write a report. But in any event, whether the police officers, forgot about it 2 months later when they were first asked about it, whether they just decided she's never going to press charges, and you'll see on the call report they're insisting that to the second set, it doesn't make any difference. The point is, this is still false. This statement is still false.
But anyway, going to those elements, it says that they only, according to...
Wait a minute. First, we need to explain what that means. So the jurors are given 3 verdict forms for each of her statements within the article that she wrote. And the subsequent elements that we're going to discuss are what the jurors need to use to determine if the 3 statements from the Washington Post op-ed is indeed defamation of Depp's character.
Okay. So with that in mind, we think about what Heard's lawyer stated, that the only way the jury is able to rule in Depp's favor is if they are all in agreement with each of those 7 elements on that verdict form. Now, I hate to say this, I know I shouldn't say it, but if the jurors were present during that trial from beginning to end, there's absolutely no way they can, in good conscience, rule in Heard's favor. She was caught in so many lies, and she failed to provide substantial evidence. So that first element requires that the jurors believe that Heard published the statement, and that statement is, I think Paprika just read it. Did you read it, Paprika?
Yes.
Okay, so the one that starts within 2 years ago, well, the verbiage, there were three things in that statement that convinced me that she published the statement. The verbiage reads in 2 places, I, which is personal. She said, I became a public speaker, and she says, I felt the full force. No one else can speak for her, and I don't think they would even try to do so without her permission, because those are personal statements as to how someone feels. And for someone else to put that out without the consent of the individual making that statement, that would be criminal. So the fact that it was published at all lets you know that Ms. Heard indeed agreed with the statement. Otherwise, you would have heard of a suit brought up against the Washington Post. And also you can consider the fact that she chose at a later date to post the op-ed to her personal Twitter stating, today, I, again personally, published this op-ed in the Washington Post. And at the bottom of her tweet is the beginning of the initial post where it says, I spoke up against sexual violence. So I think that first element is pretty easy. Am I wrong? What do you think?
No, I think there's no question here. The answer is yes, because both teams, Depp's and Heard's, as well as Heard herself, stated she wrote the articles. So in my mind, the jurors could and should and can only respond in the affirmative yes to that first element. And that brings us to the second element, which is in conjunction with the first. If Heard actually made or published that statement, and was that statement about Depp? So if we consider the facts presented in the case, first, her TRO, which is a temporary restraining order, was filed in court on May 27, 2016 against Depp for domestic abuse, which was 2 years ago, which is what she alluded to in the article. Number 2, throughout the trial, she has accused him of what? Domestic abuse. Again, it's what the article is about. And third, her relationship and divorce was with none other than Depp. There's no mention about any other relationship at that time 2 years ago. And for me, the fourth one, which is the most incriminating factor, the article says, and I quote, imagine a powerful man as a ship like the Titanic. That ship is a huge enterprise. When it strikes an iceberg, there are a lot of people on board desperate to patch up holes, not because they believe in or even care about the ship, but because their own fates depend on the enterprise. End quote. So let's break that down, shall we? Powerful man. 2 years ago, the only powerful man she was in a relationship with was Depp. His career is that big enterprise. Striking an iceberg is Heard as the iceberg, and the allegations is the strike to that iceberg. The lot of people mentioned in the article on board are those employed due to Depp's big acting enterprise, which are the agents, producers, bodyguards, runners, assistants, production companies, and the movie-making franchise, which includes the Pirates of the Caribbean. So a lot of people are the ones patching the holes, which is the allegation of abuse. And they did this not because they care about the ship, which she is implying is Depp or believe in him, but because their fates or their jobs, in whatever capacity that is in connection with that big enterprise of Depp's acting career, is in danger. So what part of that, I ask, is left to wonder about? I mean, what part don't you get? Again, 2 years ago, she was embroiled in a case with Depp, a powerful man with his $43 million earnings, several properties, and not to mention owning several private islands, all making him a big enterprise that has to employ a lot of people. So again, in my mind, the jurors should and can only respond in the affirmative to element number 2. Yes, it was indeed about them.
Yeah, I agree, and there's not much more I can say on that. You covered it well. Element number 3, with that one, again, I think all we need to do is remember that throughout the trial, Miss Heard has been caught in too many lies regarding the alleged abuse. Camille superbly drew attention to the fact that Miss Heard was, in fact, the aggressor and the abuser in the relationship. In her dealings with Depp, as well as with others, such as her ex-assistant, whom she spat on, her sister, whom was afraid of her, and her ex-partner, whom she went to jail for or over, etc. Also, Camille made a great point stating that throughout the trial, there were no evidence provided showing Depp as a physical or sexual abuser. So, but every opportunity that Heard had to present valid evidence, she instead presented pictures of bad behavior from Depp, like his pictures of him, as Camille says, sleeping, but was actually him falling out drunk, his writing on a mirror, and his lines of cocaine on the table. All those things, in my opinion, was captured by Miss Heard so that it can be used to allude to abusive behavior. And while I'm on the subject of that scene with the line of cocaine on the kitchen table, to me that seems a bit staged. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the lines are too far towards the middle of the table, which would make it hard for Depp to do the line. I mean, he would actually have to like lean way over the table to do the lines. I don't know. What do you think?
Sounds like a valid point. So for my review of element number 3, was the statement false that Heard made in the article? Again, we have to go to the facts presented in the case. First, there were no pictures of Heard's bruises suffered at the hands of Depp. Second, there were no medical records of her reporting or even being treated for abuse, despite the fact that she had medical personnel, which was revealed during the trial, 3 nurses and the doctor at her disposal. Third, there were no officers that were witnesses called or no officer reports, but to the contrary, in Amber's response to a call because of domestic violence, every time the officers appeared on the scene, usually standing 3 feet from her in many instances, saw no visible signs of abuse on her person. So again, what should the jurors come back with? In the affirmative, yes. And that leads us to the 4th element, which says, was the statement or did it have defamatory implications about Depp? Again, all referring to the case. Plain and simple, if the first 3 elements were in the affirmative yes, then we can only say yes to this 4th element.
I think that's answered by the statement that Heard published, which really isn't in agreement with what you're saying. But thinking of element 5 and commenting on the intention of Heard, I felt like, yes, Heard intended to defame Mr. Depp, and that's evident in the timing of how everything happened. The fact that within the 15 months that they were married, she never alluded to domestic violence or abuse. I think back on the testament of the 2 doctors. It was Dr. Hughes and Dr. Shannon. In speaking of Heard's state of mind, both of them referenced histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality. And they associated what Camille kept bringing up, that fear of abandonment. They associated fear of abandonment as being a big part of both those illnesses. And that's what motivates her, that fear of abandonment. When she realized that Depp was done, that's when she reacted. And she herself, stated that she felt like she had 3 to 4 personalities at times. I said it from the beginning, Paprika. The woman, she's loco.
Yeah, element 5 is, does the defamatory implication, or was it designed and intended by her? Again, I always refer to the facts presented in the case. If she was never abused, which all of the recordings of her and Depp's interactions proved, but was in actuality the abuser in the relationship, and we have her under oath saying that she did indeed hit him, then that would mean that the TRO would be false. Her being an ambassador for abused women would be misleading, and the writing of this article would be under false pretenses. So then that would be an implication of being designed and intended to cause defamation of the character of Depp. So element number 6 says, due to the circumstances surrounding the publication of this statement, it conveyed defamatory implication to someone who saw it other than Depp. So here again, we have the facts. That's all we can go by. With her telling the world by means of filing a temporary restraining order against Depp, stating that he abused her for the entirety of their relationship, keeping that in mind, and then a person subsequently then reading that Washington Post op-ed with the impression in their mind that it's about Depp, then yes, that would definitely convey defamatory implications to Depp's character to whoever read that article.
Yeah, I agree. And that takes us to that 7th element. And Mr. Depp would have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that Heard made the statement with actual malice. And I think absolutely. And I also feel that element 6 and 7 go hand in hand, because her decision to file the TRO was a result of the anger that she felt over his decision to leave the marriage. So I feel if you prove 6 to be yes, then you also have to prove 7 to be yes.
Yeah, so because the 7 elements said the statement that Heard made, was it made with malice? And malice is defined as it relates to the law is evil intent on the part of a person who commits a wrongful act injurious to others. So based on all the evidence presented in the 6-week trial, it appears, based on the evidence presented, there was no domestic abuse to Heard as described and testified to by Heard. And if indeed there was no domestic abuse to Heard at the hands of Depp, again, the filing of a TRO, the writing of an op-ed, to that effect, it would constitute as malice on the part of Heard towards Depp. So for the 7 elements that we just went over and the answers that we provided for that first statement, they can also apply to the second statement that the jurors have to consider in the defamation trial. But for me, I can't speak on the third statement because it was not part of the original Washington Post op-ed published on December 18, 2018, but it was included in the People publication in 2020. So therefore you can't prove that Amber actually wrote that statement.
Yeah, that's true. It wasn't on the original one, but I think that's what Depp's team was trying to bring out, that even though Heard said that she didn't say the words in the op-ed, the fact that she decided to include the Washington Post op-ed to her Twitter post, that was her giving approval of the opinion that they put in that Washington Post. Otherwise, she could have left that part out of the tweet altogether.
You know what? You make a valid point, because if she said in the original Washington Post op-ed she was only talking about the domestic violence, and then after she filed the TRO for sexual violence, if she then tweeted adding what she claimed she did not write about sexual violence, then she was purposely trying to reach a broader audience to solidify her claim in that filing of the TRO.
Yeah, I agree. Well, peeps, that's all for now. Let us know what you think. Should Depp come out on top or should Heard? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't already, please hit the thumbs up and click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you will be notified when our next video drops. And don't forget to share. Until the next video, we
Pass
the
mic
to
you.
and scene.